Okay, so let me discuss the second part of the concept of power in anthropology. In our previous tutorial, we were discussing about the why power is such an enduring concept for anthropologists and what makes power to continue to dominate in much of the anthropological as well as social science theories, and why human beings have that innate nature that is sometimes called as power craving. Now, let me go towards the concept of power in early anthropologists, how anthropologists perceived the concept of power in their earlier days. Perhaps the concept of power was very much there with the 19th century evolutionists. For example, if we can remember the concept of power that is ingrained in Henry Main's concept, where he says that societies are organized with status and contract, and he also focused on the fact that kinship and territory happens to be the basis for government. So a society which was organized on the basis of status had power ingrained within the status itself. So based on a status, the society used to be governed. But later on, the scholars like Evans Pritchard and Meerfords, through their African political system, they have clearly stated that how power and authority and government can exist even when there are no separate institutions designated for governing itself. They have shown through their tribal studies that age, grade, status, etc., have everything to do with social control and exercise of power through something very similar to governance. So very clearly from the early anthropologists themselves, they were quite aware about the concept of power which is ingrained in apparently apolitical spheres like kinship, like status, like age grade, like gender, etc. Now, what was the driving force behind such contention was the very fundamental idea of functionalism, because functionalists were interested in understanding what function does a social organization or social system plays. So in order to understand that, the only factor which was important to them was to explore functions of several institutions. So therefore, how a society governs itself, if that is a question, then a British anthropologist will try to find out what governance institutions are there. But since there is none, they have tried to find out why there is none, and they have concluded that yes, there are functions being played by apparently apolitical organizations. Although we also have the example of Fayum community from New Guinea, who used to be more than 4,000 in number, but when the colonizers contacted them, they became 200 in number because they had internal conflict, because they had internal fights within the groups. And why they have died, why they have killed each other? Because of the lack of specialized institutions of governance. So governance is important, which was very much there in early anthropological contentions. And there are scholars who suggests that not every society is ruled by separate governance institutions, but there are functions of governances being played by institutions in places like Africa, among the Nuer and Talansai, which was very much successful, but not so successful in Fayum. Now, there is another approach which is known as process orientation. The earlier one was functionalist, then the process orientation. Especially with the works done by Leach and Gluckman, while Leach find out that a society can oscillate from being anarchic to intermediate to small state. So a society can change its own mechanism of governance over time. For example, Gluckman said that equilibrium as unstatic, and societies are actually living with constant dialectics, which is very much in contradiction to the functionalist model of understanding. Neo-evolutionists tried to find out classifications like band, tribe, chiefdom, state. The famous classification was made by one of the famous anthropologists. Just forgetting his name. Okay, well, I'll come back to that. But there are classificatory approaches. Sorry, Elman Service and Marshall Shahlins did some work on these. Then during 1980s and 1990s, there was a rise of feminist anthropology. That is why ethnography always talks about, always assumes the male gaze. Why there is no focus on women become a very important question. And then during 1990s, Eric Wolfs and the People Without History, which started to deconstruct the eyes of colonizers, or the ideas of colonizers on colonized. So the concept of core, periphery and semi-peripheral relationships became very much important. Now, what were the important issues for earliest anthropologists dealing with power? They looked at different facets of society. For example, they talked about power and inequality, that deals with stratification, hierarchy, caste and class. There were, of course, a focus on relational powers, how individual exercise power over other individuals, how individual is connected to a group, how group is connected to a group, and how group is connected to the individual. So there are different levels of analyzing power and inequality. Later on, there was also a parallel focus on institutional power, that is how institutional structure actually influences the decision making capacity of its people, and how governance system through codified rules continue to dominate people's perception. And then there were scholars who were discussing about the colonial influence of power and powerlessness, colonial and neo-colonial, decolonizing, and therefore the approaches of subaltern studies, which virtually made upside down about the power equation within the academic discourses. So these are the few very important aspects of classic anthropologies of power, that is power inequality, institutional power and colonial influences. Now, what are the current issues of anthropology and power? How contemporary anthropologists deal with the concept of power in 20th and 21st century? So there is, of course, a new direction towards the studies of power. The study of power is no longer solely ethnographic or solely anthropological. Rather, there is a multidisciplinarity in the approach. There are new areas of research, new issues are coming up, and anthropologists, although people who do not consider them as anthropologists, they are doing research purely anthropological in nature. So every sort of the juxtaposition is actually going on. Now, what are the major issues of the contemporary times that anthropologists are studying? One is legitimacy issue, another one is power in ritual and performance. Then there is the third issue, which deals with power in communication, and also the power in the presentation of self, which is so important nowadays with the advent of selfie maniac people. And also there are other issues like power in cultural formations, power in public sphere, etc. So let me discuss with each of these things one at a time. So let us start with the issue of legitimacy. Why legitimacy is important? What gives a particular power structure its legitimacy has become a very important facets of doing research in power. Especially, for example, if you kind of explore the power of any political leader in a democratic system, what legitimizes his or her power? That is one question. Now, there are certain power brokers who do not occupy strictly any administrative or legal positions, but nevertheless they do have considerable amount of power to exercise over others. What legitimizes their powers? So there are studies, for example, tale of origin, that is, which family I belong to, which genre I belong to, from where I belong to, what have I done in my earlier days, in my childhood, in my early adulthood, what sort of social movement I was associated with. These are the kind of legitimacy issues which are coming up. Then there are certain non-rational sources of legitimization. For example, the dress pattern, ornament, the architecture where I live, the building that I live. And there is a misapprehension, according to Bourdieu, that powerful deserves power. It is such a self-contradictory, but at the same time self-fulfilling way of exercising power. That is, if I show that I already have power, I will continue to gain more power. And these are the sorts of areas where scholars like Dalloz, learners have done superb ethnographies. Now, there is another very important issue that is the location of power in ritual and performance. The things that people do in their everyday life that legitimizes the power, that legitimizes the exercise of power by certain agents, by certain actors. For example, if I worship a particular form of deity and I believe that he has a supernatural source of power, and I keep on depending on a certain forms of specialists to help me communicate with that supernatural being, power or forces, that specialist will definitely exercise a certain amount of power and control over me. So rituals reinforce social relationships, including value systems, and there are ingrained symbols within the rituals, which in turn strengthens the existing power relations. Now, the third important issue is the power in communication. That is, how people use the communication medium to exercise power. There may be direct communication. For example, I can say you have to do this or you have to do that, and by virtue of my position in a society or by virtue of my position in a administrative hierarchy, I may be able to make you do certain things. But there are certain very interesting things. Those are the unsaid part. For example, if I say someone who is inferior to me that, see, Mr. X, the window is open. I'm not saying Mr. X that shut the window, but it simply means close the window, because I'm saying that the window is open. There are certain understudied aspects in the area of power as well. For example, threats and promises, command and subordination, normative commitments, etc. are not that well studied. There is also a very important part of communication, that is a construction of message. How you construct a message is actually makes you construct the world itself. Messages are so constructed that speakers doesn't make any request or comment but anticipate listeners' decision in the light of certain sort of new information. For example, if I say the particular minister belonging to a particular community, or belonging to a particular political party, has certain culturally negative aspects in his or her character. Now, his or her character has nothing to do with managing an office or managing a governance system or make service delivery attainable. But people may perceive that this person with such and such character is not a suitable person to occupy the chair anymore. So if I kind of make a new sort of what should I say, information available to the public sphere, I can anticipate people's decision, which can radically alter, right? Perhaps this is the major way by which nowadays political parties are campaigning, and that is a very catchy phrase, is very, very popular nowadays. That's called post-truth. When you have, when you manufacture truth, when you deliver truth with a certain sort of intentions, you can anticipate a certain sort of outcome as well. Uh, so so there lies the importance of selection strategies. For example, there may be a 15 minutes of video of a person having attending a certain ceremony or something like that, and I am showing you a 15-second clip where that person is dangerously close to a lady or vice versa, and then I am adding a popular advertisement at the background which talks about gender discrimination. You can readily understand how people will perceive that person's character in a certain way. So, very clearly, selection strategy in a communication is also extremely important. Now, the concept of power in presentation of self. How a person presents itself. We all know the scholars like Goffman, George Herbert Mead, Irving Goffman. I'm not talking about the other Goffman. I'm talking about Irving Goffman, George Herbert Mead. They have concretely studied the presentation of self in everyday life. So speakers' trustworthiness, how to gain trust, how to present yourself in a particular way becomes very important. And it has something to do with the construction of charismatic personality. So the kind of dress you wear, the kind of language you use, the kind of company you keep, all these things will have definite influence on how powerful you may appear to the others. There are excellent works like Krogstad and Storvik in their 2017 book. They have studied the linkage of power and sex appeal. They say that lack of sex appeal simply means lack of political appeal as well. And there are ranges of representation of the self. For example, in Scandinavian countries, you will find a political leader in a very modest way. They are presenting themselves in a very modest way. But it is completely different in Nigeria or even in India, for example. There is another dimension where anthropologists are doing excellent, superb research, is a power in cultural formations. How cultural formations assumes a structure-like pattern, a template, which people is supposed to follow. So there may be a cultural formation of doing certain things in certain way, which will influence the social structure. The social structure eventually will shape your action. This action will shape you, will shape your identity. So cultural formation is always an extremely important factor. For example, aggregation effect. An individual rational behavior can be superseded by irrational behavior of certain number of people, because the number happens to be very important. Now this number leads to cultural disharmony. For example, religious conflicts, which is completely irrational, but it does have certain amount of power lying within, and it has everything to do with cultural formation. Now, how power is located within the public sphere has been hotly debated by scholars across disciplines. There are excellent theoretical development which I will discuss in the next video. But nevertheless, anthropologists are doing superb research in the area of the location of power within the public sphere. how media is intervening public sphere, how the public man, the concept of public man, the conscious public man is falling because of the spread of late capital surveillanced society. The importance of public sphere in shaping public opinion has been studied brilliantly by scholars like Habermas, and how public sphere and media complement with each other to create the democracy vibrant. These are some of the important facets where anthropologists are doing research in power. Of course, we live in a 21st century in a late capital society, and we cannot ignore the power of market, which is a very important and emerging, almost already emergent area of research for anthropologists. Conspicuous consumption. How conspicuous consumption is percolating every part of the hierarchy, of the social hierarchy, is a very important area of research. How brand name links itself with youthfulness, sophistication, seriousness, and how wearing a particular brand at a particular point of time makes you more acceptable to the society. For example, when you are partying out with your friends, you might prefer wearing a particular branded clothes, but when you are attending a board meeting, you will prefer another form of brands. It's not only the dress pattern, it is a brand itself as well. So how branding and commercialization of goods is exercising power over us. For example, global market and the dimensions of power. How a handful of international brands controlling the entire social and symbolic capitals. How materials and their imitations are colonizing the entire world. How parallel rise in films funded by these corporations reinforces the symbolic values associated with it. How homogenization is advocated by capitalists around the world. These are the very important areas of research for anthropologists, and how people perceive, how people construct their meanings within it are becoming increasingly important areas of research. How internet and power is connected. Now internet, we all know how it has changed, revolutionized the way we live in today's world. We know the Cambridge Analytics, in fact today they have said that they are shutting down because there are allegations, because people are backing up from them, because they have used Facebook data to influence our decision making, in not only marketing areas but also in selecting our political leaders. So these are the sort of areas where anthropologists are nowadays working. In my next video, I will discuss on the contemporary theories of power. Before then, thank you for listening to me. Thank you for watching my video. You subscribe my YouTube channel, and you go to my blog, which is shumonanthromaterials.blogspot.com. Thank you.